Olá, pessoal. Bom dia. Bem-vindo.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to open this event today here in Rio de Janeiro in the morning, maybe in other places in the world in the afternoon, maybe even in the evening. If you're watching us, it's a pleasure to have you here. My name is Deborah Albu. I'm a coordinator in the area of democracy and technology here in the Institute of Technology and Society in Rio de Janeiro. I'm going to moderate this event, our Varanda 107, that is going to present the results of a very interesting research that is carried out by our institute and the Global Index. We are going to talk about these results. It's a pleasure having you here. I'm going to give you a few warnings before I start entering the topic of this varanda. First of all, I would like to thank you all and say that we have interpreters of sign language here in the Portuguese channel, as you can see, and also in all of the other channels. We have a channel that is entirely in Portuguese, a channel that is in English, and also a channel that uses the original audios, and you can listen in English and in Portuguese because we have here a multinational panel of panelists. So please feel free to choose a link that is more convenient to you. All of the links are on the chat of YouTube. So you can click there. You can watch it later. We're going to leave the links to you and you can choose the best channel. And reminding you that we're going to present a research, which is a research on risks for disinformation by the ITS and the Global Disinformation Index. This research is available on PDF. You can click on the link to see the entire research. On this event, we're going to do a presentation of this research. It is worth telling you a little bit that the Global Disinformation Index is a nonprofit organization that operates based on three principles: neutrality, independence, and transparency. And GDI, we're going to talk a lot about the Global Disinformation Index as GDI, was the one that developed this methodology that was applied not only to Brazil, but also to other countries like South Africa, Argentina, and many others. You can also check these other researches at the GDI website that will also appear on the chat for you to look at, www.disinformationindex.org. ITS and GDI did a partnership in March this year to bring this methodology to Brazil. And the idea of this research is to assess a little what are the risks of the media market in disinformation. And this is carried out based on this methodology that is being developed and perfected by GDI. And as researchers here in Brazil, we have adapted it. The business of news expanded to the online environment, and there were transformations in the distribution of news that has exposed this industry to new risks of disinformation. The websites have received incentives, financial incentives to expand disinformation, to increase their online traffic, and also publicity. In the meantime, we also are doing this event online because we live this pandemic that put us in an unprecedented sanitary crisis, making us depend on information that is online. So it is worth telling that this research aims at presenting today in this varanda the results of this research here in Brazil, applying this methodology that was developed by GDI. And we are going to tell you a little bit of this throughout three presentations with our panelists. The first one of them is Tayane Guimarães, a researcher here at the Institute. Emmanuel Brandi from GDI, the Global Disinformation Index, and Andrea Doyle, who is also a researcher and worked directly on this research. I'm going to introduce each one of them and pass the floor to each one of them, but I would like to give you a last reminder. You can use the chat at all times, so please feel free to ask the questions that you have or the comments that you have, what you thought about the research, and we're going to collect those questions and comments. And at the end of those presentations, we're going to ask the questions to our speakers. So we're looking forward to all of the questions and comments. Without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Tayane Guimarães, who is going to speak a little bit about the context where we live regarding disinformation and the context of the media market in Brazil. Tayane is a journalist, graduated from the Federal Fluminense University. She won the award Controversies in Journalism for the under notification of homophobic crimes. For 7 years, she has been in civil society organizations, having worked for Afro-Hegi Cultural Group and the communications and campaigns at the Amnesty International. She is now a master's student at the Federal Fluminense University, and she is now a researcher at the area of democracy and technology at ITS. Tayane, the floor is yours, and I'll be right back after her speech. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Emmanuel and Andrea, and thank you to the other people who are assisting this Varanda and other researchers that took part in this process of research and this report in partnership with DDI. It is very important for us to having carried out this work and sharing with everyone this work in this Varanda. The main thing about this space is being able to share some results and some findings of this research. But before all of that, it's important to bring back the operational context in which this research was carried out. So I would like to talk to you about some data, but also build with you in this exchange, in this dialogue, reinforcing this element that Deborah said, that this chat is open and we are available for this conversation and the questions and comments. I would like to build with you a timeline, maybe, of what is this moment that we are living and where this research happened, when this research happened. In the first place, it's important to remember that in 2019, we had a number of households in Brazil with access to the internet that reached almost 51 million, 71% of the total of households in Brazil with access to the internet. This is an increase of over 5 million households when compared to 2018. So this point of the democratization of access to the internet to talk about the production and the dissemination of information is a key point. And this growth has to do with especially the dissemination of access to the internet among more vulnerable groups. So for the first time, more than half of the households in the lower income classes are connected to the internet, to the World Wide Web. And that also brings us some challenges, especially because most of those users with low income and access to the internet today, they access the internet through their cell phones. So the cell phone continues being, in the last few years, the device that is most used to access the internet. 99% of the Brazilian users use their cell phones. And that places us in a reality that we also like to mention when we talk about information. It is an access to the internet that sometimes is limited. We know the data plans of the telephone carriers. They have some packages where even if the user has a small data package, they can access Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp. That's what we call zero rating. And that brings a lot of benefits, the perspective of always being connected somehow, but also it brings challenges. For example, access to almost exclusive information through the mediation of these social media. Sometimes the user cannot access the link of a piece of news or verify that information on Google because they do not have the full access and effective access to the internet as a whole. They have a restricted access to those platforms. So that impacts and it is related to that expansion of the consumption of information through social media. So in 2021, in the last report that was disclosed by Reuters, which is a report that is disclosed every year to talk about the media environment all over the world, 83% said that they consumed news online, including but limited to social media. And the consumption of information through newspapers or magazines decreased from 50% to 12% in the last 9 years. So that was a very drastic impact. So from 50 to 12% of printed media. We may think that it didn't happen because in the last 9 years, we lived in Brazil intensively at the end of the day, but in a more historical perspective of the information ecosystem, that actually happened. Facebook is still the main channel for consumption of information for the Brazilian population, followed by WhatsApp. It's always important highlighting that in 2017, WhatsApp had a boom because of the purchase and selling of Facebook. Here in Brazil, we already had 10% of all of the users of WhatsApp in the world. So WhatsApp had a better, a more comprehensiveness. Brazil is an important consumers market for this messaging app. Regarding economic sustainability, we are talking about a migration of this consumers market, this production of information from the physical to the digital. It is also important for us to look at this perspective of publicity, because publicity is, at the end of the day, one of the main actors in this game of production and dissemination of information. This report, this study in partnership with GDI has this perspective of looking at this market of publicity and being able to identify these risks of disinformation in this media ecosystem for companies to fund less or not fund vehicles with high risk of disinformation. So looking a little bit at this perspective of publicity, this is not by chance, but Brazil is the main publicity market of Latin America when we talk about media. Free TV is still what attracts this big revenue of publicity, but it's very perceptible, it's very noticeable. This gigantic growth of publicity in the digital market. We had a very big boom of 40% in 2019 when compared to the previous year, and we had some predictions that show a sum of 5 billion reais with expenditures with publicity in 2022 when compared to 2014. In 2014, we had 200 million with expenditures with publicity. In 2022, with a projection of 5 billion. This is a drastic growth that, of course, in the last few years, when we think about 2020 and 2021, this was even more impacting. Of course, the pandemic that we are still in impacted this market very intensively. It accelerated this migration to the digital platforms. Since 2020, the circulation of the 10 most important newspapers in Brazil decreased 10%, and those digital readers of the same newspapers increased over 60% in the first semester of 2020, which is the most updated data in the first semester of 2021. So we noticed the scenario because almost all of the newspapers, they offer subscriptions at very cheap prices. There was a reduction because there was a reduction on those subscriptions. We had an element. We know that
verdade assim, né? Depois foi descoberto que não era tão assim
we
desse
noticed that it didn't happen quite like this, but in the beginning of the pandemic,
vai receber o jornal na porta da sua casa e ele vai estar contaminado.
that we had an information that people were no longer subscribing to the newspapers because they did not want to receive newspapers in their houses because the newspapers could be contaminated. And now we can see much more investment in publicity in those digital platforms, a very big use of automatized platforms, automatized tools with Google and Amazon to direct the revenues to the websites with more clicking ratings that had generated drastic damages. In the beginning of 2020, the Brazil Bank, one of the biggest public banks in Brazil, was sponsoring websites of disinformation. The media ecosystem in Brazil, Deborah, I'm going to ask you, please, if I'm over my time, you can let me know and I can finish in 5 minutes because usually I speak a lot. In the sense, the media ecosystem in Brazil that is historically hegemonized by big groups of communication and individual proprietors of great relevance in the country went through a deep change in the last few years. We had the appearance of many new actors, the creation of the blogs, personal pages on Facebook, on Instagram, influencers, which is absolutely positive from a perspective of the democratization of the means that disseminate information, but also brings new challenges. We see that even though we have this reduction of the hegemonization, it placed us in an ecosystem of more polarized and more decentralized information dissemination. There were some studies in ITS, and one in 2018 specifically analyzed the consumption of information by clusters that were from opposing parties on Twitter. We noticed that those readers were consuming information from completely different sources. And as the more isolated those readers were, the more radicalized the messages they shared. So it is very difficult for us to talk about the democratic debates on certain topics or it is more difficult to understand the whole disinformation that circulates on a certain topic when we have networks that are completely isolated, where Brazilian citizens are consuming completely different types of information and news. Besides that polarization that we have seen since 2016, before the elections of 2018, we have this phenomenon on WhatsApp, which does not happen only in Brazil, it happens in India and many other countries. But in Brazil, this is a key point. Where we know that the circulation of news through links on WhatsApp is very intense. We have seen in the researchers post 2018, and that is a big problem because we researchers noticed that most of those links that are communicated on those WhatsApp groups are from vehicles that are known to be disseminators of disinformation. Those are vehicles that are constantly verified by checking agencies that we have in Brazil. A Lupa, Estadão Verifica, those agencies that have a very important work, and vehicles that were mentioned, that were complained about by the investigation committee of disinformation and fake news, very relevant actors, not only that gave testimonials in those investigation assemblies of fake news, and those actors were directly related to campaigns of disinformation in the Supreme Court, but also related to issues of public health in the COVID-19 context. I'm not going to go through some detailed data that are in the report. The report is available online. As Deborah said, you can look at it in more detail later. But some more important issues. Since 2020, we have been through a very intense political debate about the regulation of those platforms for us to contain this disclosure of disinformation. This is a very complex subject. The Fake News Act is a very controversial act. There are some points that talk about privacy of the users, about the possibility of accessing those users and the access of those users to the digital platforms. And that legislation establishes that the ones responsible for funding, disseminating, and writing those fake news, and the ones responsible for the bots that disseminate those fake news with the intention of manipulating public debate, they could be punished to up to 5 years in prison. So we are undergoing this debate. It is still not over, especially when it comes to funding and massive production of this information with bots, with non-human actors, with non-authentic actors for dissemination of disinformation. And I believe this is still going to have some developments until the elections of 2022. And the last thing I would like to say is that the scenario also impacted the relationship of trust with the news that is disseminated in those sites and platforms. Even though there are some sites that are part of the more traditional media, this moment that we have lived in the pandemic brought some changes in the researches that have been carried out regarding the trust of people in media. This report from 2008 and 2009 with information about trust that showed a drastic fall of the trust of population in traditional media, TV, radio, and the websites of this more familiar media. In 2020, we already have some data that is completely the opposite. It shows an uncertainty in news that are shared through social media and a search of this population for more traditional vehicles that follow some patterns in the production of information that could show some more confidence on news about the sanitary crisis. So it is a change in paradigm that came probably from a feeling of fear, anxiety, and lack of trust, because there's a lot of contradictory information about COVID that circulated throughout these last 2 years, and that placed us in this scenario that is completely different than what happened in 2019. Very drastic and very fast changes in very little time. That is what we call this mediatic ecosystem in Brazil. That's what I would like to talk about when it comes to context in which this research that is carried out by GDI. And I pass the floor to Deborah, and I come back later for the debate and questions. Thank you. Thank you, Tayane, for the presentation. It is very important to understand exactly the context in which this research was developed. Before I pass the floor to Emmanuel, who is our next speaker, I would just like to say hello to Ibict from the Federal University of Rio. Thank you for watching. And just like to say hello to the groups that are watching us on YouTube. It's very good to say hello to our fellow scholars. Thank you for being with us here and sharing your questions and comments. I pass the floor now to Emanuele, and before I introduce him, I would like to do a small digression to say something very important about the risk classification methodology by GDI. This methodology does not aim at labeling these sites as reliable or not. The approach that GDI develops is anchored on the idea that there's a set of identifiers or indicators that may reflect the global risk that a certain website may disseminate or not this information. Emanuele is going to present this, and I'm going to introduce him. He is a leading product manager of Global Disinformation Index, GDI. Previously, he spent over 10 years at Google in both search and advertising. He led the international expansion and launch of branded security features for Google AdSense GDN, the world's largest ad network. Emanuele, the presentation is yours.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here. Quick introduction. My name is Emmanuel. I'm originally, you can tell from my name, I'm originally Italian. I based in UK, working for the Global Disinformation Index. So culturally, I'm quite close to Brazilian culture. I'm really happy to hear, to learn about the market. It's really fascinating. I really appreciated the previous presentation from Tayane. It was really great to learn more about the context in the market. I worked for a few years for Google in Asia, particularly in emerging markets, and I see many common patterns with the largest emerging markets. And of course, Brazil is one of the very largest emerging markets. So there are some interesting elements in common with other emerging markets and other elements that are quite unique to Brazil. And I'll cover on them quickly during the presentation. So I'll share my screen in a minute. And yeah, like Deborah mentioned, I'm going to also cover our methodology and also our definition of disinformation, which is really one of the most unique traits of how we tackle the problem. Some of the most distinctive components of GDI is like the way we define disinformation, which we think makes it much more tractable problem. And also remove some of the issues with with public debate of true versus false, and let us focus on the issue of real world threat to individuals and institutions and organizations and groups. And the other component is that we have a particular way of solving the problem of disinformation, considering that keeps in mind the way the media ecosystem works, that is mostly advertising funded at the moment. And so we work in collaboration with governments, with organizations, we get funders around the democracy, and also we work with public companies, particularly in the advertising technology space. And this is important for us to work with many different actors to get this influence. And advertising is at the root of some of the editorial guideline decisions of newspapers. So it's helpful to be involved with that too. Okay, quick overview on GDI, who we are. Independent, neutral, and transparent. I'd like to say a few more words about what we actually mean with that in practical terms. Independent would mean that we don't rely on a sources to sustain ourselves. We don't rely 100% on one source. We think it would not make us independent if we rely 100% on government investment or even international organization investment. So we have different source streams of revenues to be able to allow us to sustain ourselves, working with private sector, public sector, and also the neutral component. We define with that being apolitical. So we are evidence-based. We have a methodology that is quantifiable. This is really removes the problem with partisan opinions. We tried as much as possible to remove bias. It's really hard to remove completely bias, and it's a process that we are constantly improving to remove and take out bias from our judgment. Transparency, we publish our methodology, and we have an appeals process for sites that have been detected by our system and by our experts as high risk. So we have we are open for debate as well. So the one thing I want to mention is our definition of disinformation. So we particularly chose this word disinformation, which sometimes get used as a synonym with misinformation or fake news. We think is actually as a different meaning. The disinformation means information that is intentionally used to mislead, and we go one step further by defining this as adversarial narrative. So we think disinformation is a narrative that has a particular idea about creating conflict and dividing the population. So being divisive is an important element. The other thing we want to check also that is there is a real world harm to an individual, a group, an institution. So not people may be unhappy against a particular elected government, that's fine. But if they start thinking, there's no point going to vote, the institutions like the judiciary, the police, like advocating for like the complete dismantlement of all this, that is not a political view. That is an anti-institutional, an anti-system view that we consider being a threat. And of course, science. With this, in the last year, we've seen all this in firsthand, how creating really disseminating adversarial narratives around science as an institution, as basic understanding of science, not trusting the medical advice, and may lead to people not to vaccinate their children for measles, which increase, of course, deaths. And there is clearly a real world harm. So we are a group of experts. We have different backgrounds. My background is internet, but we have in internet technologies, but we also have backgrounds from the media industry, from public advocacy organization. We want to tackle the problem considering that you're talking about digital disinformation, following the way that the web is really distributed. So the web is distributed like what's called a power law distribution or a long tail distribution. There is a very small number of sites in every market and globally that have a lot of traffic, and many sites that have very little traffic. So we are using two different approaches. For the top sites in a market, we use manual expert assessments, which is what we cover in this study for Brazil. And for all the other sites that are in the language, but there is no possibility, it's like an ocean of small sites. There is no possibility for humans to look at them individually, we use machine learning, which is a established technology to analyze content large scale. And we have a system where we identify classifiers, machine learning classifiers for around 20 topics, and we constantly improve it to flag the risk for specific kinds of disinformation, like, for example, misogyny or anti-5G narratives that have been spun quite recently. And we add some time, we retrain these classifiers so that they are updated. And this is really a tool. So the machine doesn't make any determination on the risk. It's just a way to flag sites for a manual review process. So there is still a human, there is still an expert on the market to make the final determination. Media market assessment. So this analysis of the top of the market has been performed so far in 19 countries, and we want to get to 35 by the end of next year. So we have an ambitious target there. Brazil, particularly, is one of the biggest ones, one of the biggest markets, one of the most important, where we see milestones for this year. So this is the numbers. These are the sites that have been covered by the analysis, and this is the distribution of risk that we see in the market. So it ranges from minimum risk. So the green sites actually are the quality ones, and the maximum risk are the bad quality ones. We can go later in details into the way that this index is calculated. There is two main pillars we look at. Look at content and operations on the site. And we can just mention already, this is an index. So it's a compounded metric. Now, they go into details about the two pillars. So the content pillar is where we analyzed, and we can talk more about it later. This is when we analyze the content on the sites. And I wanted to mention a few words on why is Brazil unique? What we notice in Brazil that is different from other markets. And we see that on average, the content pillars, so the quality of sensationalism, like the issues with bias and sensationalism in content, is a little higher than average for markets. So this is actually the lowest we've seen to markets until now. And this may be a number of reasons. Normally, we see ranges around 80. There may be around a number of reasons around this. Probably the quickly, like Tayane mentioned earlier, the fact that the market is quickly evolving from controlled by a few groups to a very diversified market. Maybe has something to do with it. Maybe it's just a phase. But this is an interesting thing I wanted to share. And the other element we notice is the operations pillar, which tend to be low, but unfortunately, this is an issue that is common to many other markets. So with operations, we mean being clear about editorial policy, having the name of the author of the article, being clear about who's funding, who owns the newspaper, the news outlets. And yeah, such kind of elements, we can list them more in detail. So this is actually quite common for emerging markets, and we see India is similar, but it's generally low. Good news now. This is the Undermine Trust Barometer, and it's published every year, and tells us what is the reaction of the public. So we see the media ecosystem, the quality could be better, but the quality of consumer is actually really good. Users, consumers are really asking for better quality in media. So they're really keeping advertisers accountable for improving the quality of media. And this is a sign that there is a possibility for impacting this by making some pressure on advertisers and whoever is funding the newspapers through ads. Why this is important? Brazil is the really fast growing. Is the third fastest growing market when it comes to digital spend. So advertisers really want to invest in the market. And Latin America is the fastest growing region. So we really hope that they will care in the previous chart, the fact that consumers really want to have better quality and they're keeping advertisers accountable. A few words on methodology, how we get to these results today. So these are the two content pillars. So the two pillars, one is content, one is operations. We can go more in detail about what we actually look at in the content pillar. So we look at the title, how clickbait it is, the attribution, the tone, the targeting, if the narrative is targeting a particular group, how recent is the news, if it's sensationalist or if it's an in-depth analysis on a topic that is known for a while, and the credibility of the source. So this is done in a way that is anonymized. We can talk later about how we reduce bias in analyzing this. There's a number of steps. With operations, we look at the ownership of the site, who's funding the site, where the revenue comes from, the editorial guidelines, how they correct, if they have a policy for correcting mistakes, if there is an email address to correct inaccurate reporting or not, and also how independent they are from an editorial perspective, if they are strongly siding one party, or they have their own independent view. An important piece of our analysis is we are really analyzing individual sites, but in a way we are also giving an assessment on the market overall. Now, this is not really important to get the overall. We don't really want, at this stage, we don't want to get on a level of risk for the entire market. We are still looking at individual sites, but it's still important the way we pick the sites, and is an ongoing process that we are improving over time. But we try to do our best to get really to the top of the market. To do this, we use various signals like Alexa rankings. We are using also other sources. Lately, we switched to other providers of web analytics, Facebook and Twitter followings. This is very relevant for Brazil, as social media is huge in Brazil. And also we work with our partners locally on figuring out whether we are missing any of the major news outlets or regional coverage news that may be important to include in the report. Our approach, so it draws from our analysis is based on the Journalism and Trust Initiative standards. So we have a panel of experts who help us define this methodology. And the risk rating is defined as a standard deviation. So we keep in consideration all these factors, and there is a composite indicator that keeps in mind all of this. So this is what boils down to the overall risk score for the site. But in some cases, we use only the content pillar, which might be a way to better understanding the content, the actual threat of the content itself. And this is finally the few steps we use to mitigate bias. There are many, we just list a few. The training process for the experts, we make sure that they are trained in a consistent way. And we are checking the reliability of how they agree on a single rate, on a specific rating. If two raters receive the same training and they have very different outcomes, it means the interpretation of our framework may not be right, and we go back to training. So making sure that there is a common understanding of what we define all these different categories mentioned before. One step we have to reduce bias in the operations pillar is to have multiple reviewers, at least two, sometimes more, to ensure that we cover different points of view, and we could reconcile that for accuracy if there is different point of view from a political point of view as well. So for operations, this happens for both operations and content. We have two independent reviewers at least. And the text, one important thing to notice is that when the reviewers look at the text, there is no reference to the site. There is purely text, and there's no reference to the website. So the name of the author is stripped off. So they're actually purely looking at the content on the page. And this is what they use to make the determination of whether this is biased or sensationalist, and so on. So this is a brief presentation. Yeah, open for questions. Anything? I don't know if you want to go question to the end, but thank you for allowing me to share this.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Obrigada, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Let's leave the questions to the end. And I remind you that the chat is going to be open for you to ask your questions and make your comments. Thanks for the presentation. I think your presentation is important because it speaks not only about the methodology that GDI applies, but it inserts Brazil in a more global context. You're looking at different countries, and your understanding why Brazil is so important to be analyzed as well. I pass the floor to Andrea Doyle, who is going to present the results of the research. But before I introduce her, Andrea was one of the researchers, one of the reviewers who worked on this research. But besides her, Carla Rodriguez, who is following us on the chat, she sent us a hello. Hello, Carla. And also other authors of the report, Edson Fernando and Ana Carolina Bonelli. They are also part of ITS, specifically in the area of democracy and technology. Hello to you too. I hope you are with us as well. Andrea Doyle is a doctor in science and information by PPGCI EBICT at the Federal University of Rio, a researcher on critical education for ICTs and the deconstruction of gender stereotypes. Currently, she is a researcher at the Scientific Knowledge Networks project at IBICT, coordinated by Milton Shintaku, and a collaborator of the Information Production Project for Combating Violence Against Women. She's a member of FEBAB, Red Coinfu, Media Cult, and the UNESCO Meal Alliance. She's a mother, former smoker, excited and earthy. I loved your description, Andrea. Andrea, the floor is yours. You can start your presentation. You're muted, Andrea, but don't worry. Can you hear me now? Can you see my presentation? Your presentation screen is appearing, and you're soon going to appear on top of our sign language interpreter. Okay, I can see myself now and my presentation. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. I was wonderfully introduced. I'm very happy to be here showing the results of my research. Emmanuel already gave you the global overview, so we can notice that there is a very risky scenario in Brazil. So half of our studied websites were in the red section of the chart. We had 3 websites that were in minimum risk and 3 that were in low risk. Let me show you the chart again. This is the general chart that Emmanuel already showed. And between the 2 pillars, we can notice that the content pillar had the better results than the operations pillar. And I was surprised that when Emmanuel said that our content result was slow when compared to the other countries, because we thought that our content was relatively good and the operations was the one that we should improve. But I'm going to explain a little. I'm going to go into detail about the indicators, and I brought here an overview. The results of the content operations separated by the risk classifications. Some ways of looking at the websites and the news that are within those websites. And here, specifically about the content that was my section of the research, actually. This is the detail of the indicators, and here we can see above average, we have a correspondence between the content and the title of the news piece, which is very high. We have the presence of the lead, which is the sentence below the headline of the news. This has a relatively good result. And we also have the characteristic of having a target and speaking ill of that target specifically. There's always that indicator of multiple targets, not a specific target, a specific person or a specific group. Here on this part, we can see below the average the biases and the sensationalist language. There was a result below average. And here to the side, we had the recent coverage, recent in relation to the event that it's informing.
De ser coberto por outros veículos também. E aí, essa
And it is common in relation to the event being covered by other vehicles as well. This is announcing something close to the date of the event, and other vehicles disclosing something that is the same event. And another quality indicator is giving the breaking news about an event. So other vehicles do not cover the same event. This is another quality indicator. As Emmanuel said, we looked at the news itself, the text, the internal construction of the news when it came to content. The language that was used, the way that the argument was built. And when it came to the operations, we looked at the website. The vehicle, the company, the construction of the website, how things are displayed on the website. We have a relatively low result in the overall average, and within the results themselves, we have the issue of ownership that was above average, the editorial principles and practices, they were also above average, and the comment policies, if there's moderation, if there are some guidelines, if they delete posts, was also slightly above average. And below average, we see funding, that are needed for this idea of transparency and neutrality.
E essas outras duas, os piores, as piores notas do
And the worst ratings were attribution, because it's very expensive, which means identifying your sources, identifying the authorship, identifying if that's a new piece of news or an opinion article, different journalistic genres. So this attribution globally was lacking. And ensuring accuracy, that was way below average. So the fact-checking pre-publication. So we're looking at the websites. We're looking at the policies, the declared policies of those websites regarding fact-checking. We have the fact-checking pre-publication, and we have the declaration of errors that happened before, and we are checking if those policies are described on the website. In terms of results, to go into detail, further detail about what we found in those indicators, I'll pass on to Tayane so she could present the final recommendations, and I can pass the slides for her. Thank you, Andrea. Well, I think we can also highlight that our main intention in this research is thinking about the perspective of improving the scenario. So when we investigate, when we do research with the intention of understanding how the Brazilian media ecosystem is doing related to international standards, is doing an analysis on this object to recommend things so that the vehicles can improve their works. With this data that Andrea brought us, which is not a positive scenario, of course, most of the vehicles did not achieve the minimum risks of disinforming their audience. Some of the basic recommendations are worth highlighting here. Well, first of them is using operational and journalistic patterns that make information about the general policies transparent. During the operations phase, when we were looking at all of the criteria and analyzing the websites, most of the vehicles needed improvement in transparency regarding their guidelines, not only guidelines about funding, which is the second recommendation. They should publish the sources of funding clearly on the website, either if they come from the private sector or donations or services or support from civil society movements or organizations. That is a key point, but also related to policies, related to editorial dependency, not only related to those who own that vehicle, but also related to the journalists themselves. We know that there are a series of situations where we can talk about conflicts of interest. We can write news pieces from after you receive some incentives, financial incentives. Sometimes it is forbidden to write a story when you receive financial incentives, so we have to disclose this. There should be guidelines to correct a news piece that was written previously, way before we talk about disinformation and fake news. Some errors happen, and they will happen, not only intentionally, but fact-checking errors in the process of contacting a source. So there should be those corrections. So there should be guidelines to when that correction is going to happen and where on the website or in the printed material. So many vehicles did not have policies for comments on the website. We think this is obvious because many hate speeches could happen in that space. So it is very important to have clear guidelines on that. And other recommendations, fact-checking practices should be included. we're not talking about fact-checking agencies. This is not a key part of their work, but they should do fact-checking because it is part of journalism itself. The exercise of their work includes fact-checking before and after the publication of this content. So that should be made transparent in the website. They should explain what is this process and how the readers, how the citizens should contribute with this process. That is very recommended. Another element that was very strange for us has to do with those credits in the writing of the articles. This is crucial. All of the websites of those vehicles should have not only the name of the journalist and the editors responsible for those pieces. That should be a transparent guideline on the website. This is key. This is crucial. We should not give up on that. The name of the journalist guarantees not only the veracity of knowing that there was a journalist behind that information. I think my presentation actually got disconnected, but I can continue. It guarantees that there was a journalist behind that article, but it guarantees who you should talk to in case there was fake information, in case there was disinformation, so that we can hold someone accountable. And in order to do this, the society needs to know who produced that article, not only in the perspective of the vehicle, but the journalists that were responsible. Many websites did not have the names of the journalists and the editors. I can give this very certain data because we were also part of those investigations. No website had guidelines about the necessary existence of those credits. There's no guideline about having credits on articles. Even though the pillar of content had better results than the pillar of operations, there was still room for improvement. We recommend improvements because there's a lot of bias and a lot of sensationalist language. We know that it is part of our history of journalism. We cannot deny, if you study communication, if you study journalism, if you have spent your life analyzing articles and news pieces, you know that sensationalism is there in TV shows, in written vehicles. It is part of a wide range of vehicles that we have in our media ecosystem in Brazil. So this is a point that we should always pay attention to. I am also a journalist, so I understand. Sometimes we are pressured to build headlines that are very attractive, that are instigating for the audience so that they can click on it, so that the vehicles that we work for have more click ratings. All journalists live this pressure of building attractive articles. But we always should think about this threshold of writing attractive articles and writing clickbaits. So it is information over clickbaits. This is a point that had less drastic results, but we should also pay attention to that. I finish my presentation with this, and I open for Emanuele and Andrea if you want to add something, and we can open for debate in case you have questions. Thank you, Tayane. Thank you, Andrea, for the presentation of the main results and also the recommendations that we also include in this research. We have some questions, actually a lot of questions and very little time. I'm going to join two questions in one, which is the question by Marilia and a question by Augusto that was asked in the beginning of our speech. He asked, what are the paths for the solution of disinformation? We talk a lot about regulation, thinking about laws, thinking about this harsher solution as a way to solve the problem of disinformation, but I'm adapting a little, Marilia and Augusto. I'm very sorry for not using your words exactly, but in your opinion, what are the best solutions to fight against disinformation besides regulation, besides creating laws? Please feel free to answer it, any of you. It is to all of you. I'm going to let you two start because I spoke a lot. I was the last one to speak. So Andrea and Emanuele. Of course, this work is specifically a work of media analysis and media ecosystem, but in my work, we try to educate for media, for information, for competence in information or media education, so that people can understand the construction of those news. There is a part of news construction with a pillar of content, how you can build the argument, the language, the presentation. And on the other hand, the pillar of operations is who is that institution, how this piece of news fits this website, how this website fits the bigger market. And all of this is made of understandings that are not very common to be taught in schools or universities even, because all of us practically came from information sciences or communication sciences or journalism, but people who don't study this in universities or colleges, they feel more difficulties. They struggle more because they don't understand. They have to learn how to think about news in the sense of the construction of the text. So that is my path. There are other paths. Thank you, Andrea. Tayane or Emanuele, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I wanted to mention the way we look at the problem, the solution to the problem from the Global Disinformation Index is by looking at the way the media ecosystem has changed in the last few years. Diana mentioned earlier that the media ecosystem has changed a lot in Brazil in the last few years, but this has really happened globally in the last 20 years. Now the media is mostly online. The consumer is also changed. The user has changed. The consumer of the news has changed. The expectation now is to access news for free. Very few people remember what it's like to pay for a newspaper and to read. If you really want to have a big, a broader understanding of the news in the past, you had to buy maybe 10 different newspapers and read all of them, which is not humanly possible. But some people actually wanted to do that. And now it's possible to visit many websites in one day, powered by ads. And this is the way the world has changed today. So we think the solution, we are a small team, and we are outnumbered when it comes to trying to change society. And I think there's a possibility to do that. So I mention like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, like you have a special art. being a smaller, more lean opponent trying to overcome or defend yourself from something that is much bigger and heavier than you. So we need to be smart at this. And I think a solution is to work within the system and try to understand how the incentives work. So we believe that working with governments is important, but it's very dangerous for governments because it steps very closely to the issue of censorship. When the government wants to make a determination what is real, what is not, what is fake, what is not. So I think our approach is to really categorize content from a perspective of narratives and figuring out which narratives advertisers don't want to be associated with. If you think about your favorite brand, your brand that you trust and you think is the most credible, they probably don't want to be associated next to misogynistic content or anti-immigration or racist. And they definitely don't want, if you don't want to be seeing the content, they definitely don't want to be associated with that content, because that goes the reputation. There goes the reputation if they do that. So that is really the way we can work within the system to try to increase transparency. And when it comes to, so when I joined, my background is in disinformation, is in internet technology. And joining this line of work, I learned a lot around where disinformation really starts. And it's so interesting to work with internal analysts and figure out where these narratives are actually born. These information narratives are never born in media. So media is purely amplifying these narratives, but they are usually born in the dark corners of the web. So sometimes, the word disinformation actually is translated from Russia, and there was a department of the KGB actually designing to do that. So there is one particular purpose. There's two main reasons to create disinformation. One is to weaken a foreign country. So there is like the state motived. In a way, it's like a weapon. So if an opposing country is divided and is crumbling from within, that's the easiest way to overcome them. And so there is one component, but now in the last few years, what has really emerged is the economic motivation. So there is a number of outlets who decided that maybe they are already declining in traffic, and it's actually very convenient to take these narratives that are created sometimes on the dark corners of the web, right? Small groups of very angry people, and they amplify them on the masses. So we're not going to solve the problem where these things is going to start, but we can reduce and mitigate the amplification of these narratives. And to do that, we should probably use the business model. Keep in mind the business model of media that now really requires advertising. Not all. There are some very reputable newspapers that don't rely on advertising and they're on paywall, and that's great. But we understand that's not the totality of the media ecosystem. And definitely what mentioned Andrea, working on critical thinking and educating the population to discern the intent behind the information, and understanding what is true versus false, but also figuring out the motive and be able to judge, just by these factors that we've been looking at during this research. Also, people could do that. They can see who owns this newspaper that I read every day, what motivates, who's writing this piece of content. That is a very important role. It's not what we focus on, but it's definitely part of the solution.
Obrigada, Emanuele e Tayane.
Thank you, Emanuele. Tayane, please. It's nice to speak less because you reduce very much what you're going to say, because I agree with both of you. I agree with Emanuele regarding speaking about the funding disinformation. It's very important to talk about this. Those who produce intentionally news in a perspective of making political parties and political groups lose credit. That is very important issue to talk about. We talk about this today, but disinformation comes way before the scenario that we have. With the emergency assistance fund today in Brazil with the COVID-19, there was a lot of people who suffered scams. So they were robbed of their emergency assistance fund. So that was, I mean, the key point where disinformation had a boom in Brazil. We have a very big void of understanding of how these new platforms are part of any consumption and production of information on our reality today, because these people that are receiving their emergency assistance, they suffer scams, but people who are in higher income level in our society that pay 10,000 reais for their children's monthly fee for school, they are also suffering scams. So all society in Brazil are suffering scams and are suffering from disinformation. The path of media media understanding is it's a medium to long-term path. Many professors are always present in the spaces where I see debates on disinformation. It is very interesting, and I like to reinforce this. Those who are in classrooms, those who are in this process of learning are always looking forward to absorb those competencies so that they can teach the students, those professionals of education. They want to inform their students, and there's a lot of lack of investment from the public sector for this to happen.
E numa perspectiva de estratégia mais a curto prazo, né, eu sempre bato pouco
Certainly this is going to happen in long term. I think we should understand where and how people share and consume information. I always mention the research that we carried out here in ITS. It is on our website. It's the Ablatan research that we carried out with children and the youth in Brazil. It was replicated in other countries in Latin America to understand the dynamics of information, of consumption and dissemination of information among the youth. When we ask the youth, what is the reason to share information?
Informação era verdadeira e também porque uma pessoa próxima pediu para que eles
They said
fizessem.
because they believed the information was true. So it has to do with the communities around them. It has to do with their families.
No WhatsApp é a única informação que eventualmente essas pessoas estão recebendo.
We have to see that the links that they receive on WhatsApp sometimes are the only information that they have access to. Something we have to teach them is the fact-checking techniques, but sometimes they don't have data packages to access websites to do fact-checking.
Projeto maravilhoso assim para mim que o ITS ajudou a desenvolver, implementou.
In 2020, we implemented a project from FCN that developed a blog, a fact-checking blog for people to find it more easy to do the fact-checking of the information they received, a blog that didn't use their data package. And those types of initiatives are what we have to do, because we have to consider the reality of everyone. That is the kind of strategy that we should implement. We need to understand the scenario. We cannot close our eyes to the reality of communities in Brazil today and lower income societies in Brazil today because their data packages are limited. Thank you, Marília, for the question.
Obrigada, Tayane. Obrigada, Andrea. Obrigada, Emmanuel.
Thank you, Tayane, Andrea, Emmanuel. I'm going to apologize to Guilherme, Manuela, Ricardo. Many of our participants asked questions. Unfortunately, we could not answer all of the questions. You can talk to us if you want to talk more about this. Tayane, Emanuele, and Andrea left their emails. I left my email as well. I would like to thank our panelists who did not only present those researches and those slides. I would just like to say that we are in the middle of this informational chaos. Emanuele brought a very interesting concept. We should look at this as an ecology. We should look at those dynamics that are organic. Information is not new. It is not going to disappear. It is still going to be in the informational ecosystem. We as communicators and as part of the civil society, as journalists, we should think about new paths and new ways to mitigate the negative impacts of disinformation. I would like to remind you that the link to access the complete research, both in English and in Portuguese, are in our website and on the website of DDI. I would like to thank everyone who attended our webinar. I would also like to thank our interpreters of English and Portuguese, and our sign language interpreter who has been with us, and the whole team that supports us and helps us with the streaming. Renata, Thales, Stephanie, Karina, everyone from the media team, thank you very much. We would like to say goodbye and have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.